Hello, and thank you for tuning into the inaugural episode of the Mads Mikkelsen from Casino Royale crushing Daniel Craig's balls with a rope podcast, the only podcast on the internet that is exclusively dedicated to Mads Mikkelsen from Casino Royale crushing Daniel Craig's balls with a rope. This is really kind of your one-stop destination for all of your Mads Mikkelsen from Casino Royale crushing Daniel Craig's balls with a rope content needs. In-depth discussions of the scene and film, not really the film, just the scene in question. Any kind of media related to Mads Mikkelsen from Casino Royale crushing Daniel Craig's balls with a rope, crushing balls with rope techniques, skills, helpful hints. So that's really kind of what we're here today to discuss. I'm not really sure how often episodes will be. Kind of depends. I haven't set up the Patreon yet. I don't really know how much y'all want to pay me to make this series. But just for now, when I have time, we'll sit down and chat about Mads Mikkelsen from Casino Royale crushing Daniel Craig's balls with a rope. So before we get into the meat of the topic, I think it's important to kind of discuss the background and social influences and culture that placed us at that exact spot in time in which Mads Mikkelsen from Casino Royale crushed Daniel Craig's balls with a rope. So that kind of entails a discussion about James Bond, about neo-realist Italian film, Daniel Craig, Mads, my boy Mads, who in Casino Royale crushes Daniel Craig's balls with a rope. So we're kind of gonna start off this topic by just kind of giving a brief history of everything. So I guess the best way to start this off is talking about the film in question in which Mads Mikkelsen from Casino Royale crushes Daniel Craig's balls with a rope is Casino Royale. Casino Royale being the first Daniel Craig Bond film, James Bond, or 007, that being his code name. So I'd like to talk a little bit, set up the page for Mads Mikkelsen's eventual ball crushing with the rope on Daniel Craig's balls by talking a little bit about the influences that brought us there. So James Bond, what a lot of people don't really realize, or at least think about, is that Bond is one of the most iconic film characters of all time, but in reality, James Bond started as a literary character. The first novel he was in was in 1953, written by a British novelist, Ian Fleming. So James Bond is a literary character created for film, for literature by Ian Fleming. There were 12 novels that Ian Fleming wrote, and Ian Fleming actually died in 1964, only 11 years after the first James Bond movie, after the first James Bond novel. So the first James Bond novel, like I said, came out in 1953, actually was Casino Royale, and is the inspiration for two films of the same name. One of which is, of course, the real crux of this podcast. That's the one in which Mads Mikkelsen from Casino Royale crushes Daniel Craig's balls with a rope. But there were 12 novels, and while there have been many novels that have come out since Ian Fleming's death, none of them have really kind of hit the same cultural care or impact that Ian Fleming's novels had. And I don't believe any of them have been the basis of a film outside of Ian Fleming's novels, but I'm not sure about that one. But I mean, they're not great. The new novels, I mean, I haven't read any of them, but like the most recent one came out in 2015, and it's called Trigger Mortis, which is pretty, yeah. Anyway, so so what really matters here is the original 12 novels by Ian Fleming. These novels have been the inspiration for many films. In fact, to be specific, 24 Bond films have been made, and a 25th one is on the way. Once again, our boy Daniel Craig is going to portray Bond for the last time. Daniel Craig, of course, being the one who gets his balls crushed by a rope from Mads Mikkelsen. But, you know, a very historic, legendary film franchise for sure. And it started in 1962, Dr. No, the first Bond film. And of course, the first James Bond was Sean Connery. Pre Daniel Craig getting his balls crushed by a rope by Mads Mikkelsen from Casino Royale. But Sean Connery was in 6 Bond movies from 1962 until 1971. In between Connery's last 2, George Lazenby did On Her Majesty's Secret Service, but no one really remembers him because he only did 1, obviously. After Sean, Roger Moore, for pretty much all of the mid 70s to mid 80s was Bond. And he did, 7 films, I believe, 6 or 7. And then Timothy Dalton took it over for the late 80s. He only did 2. And then Pierce Brosnan did 4 from the mid 90s until 2002. And finally that led to Daniel Craig, whose first film, Casino Royale, he gets his balls crushed by Mads Mikkelsen in, as we all know. But there's a long history, of course, with Bond. It's a franchise that started back in 1962, and here we are, 2018, and it's still, going strong. That's 56 whole years. So it's kind of important to analyze, how we got to the point that in 2006, Daniel Craig starred as James Bond in the film Casino Royale and got his balls crushed by Mads Mikkelsen with a rope. So 1962, first film, Sean Connery. The Connery films kind of invented this spy genre of the sexy, suave, cool guy who, has sex with a lot of, beautiful foreign women and has this, martinis in a kooky and a weird in a silly way. And it kind of invented this genre that has kind of permeated culture in a lot of ways, or at least, the way fictional spies, deeds like that are depicted. And, a lot of the Connery movies were kind of cheesy, pretty corny, as a lot of films in the 60s were. But I think the important thing to keep in mind is that they were still kind of based in reality. His first film was 62 and his last one was 71. And I don't think, we need to go into a history lesson in this podcast about Daniel Craig getting his balls crushed by a rope by Mads Mikkelsen in Casino Royale. We don't need a history lesson, but we do know that, throughout the 60s and 70s, there was immense political and social turmoil, not just in the United States, but abroad. So while the Connery movies were kind of, cheesy, kind of silly, they still kind of represented um, the fantasies of people who were living in these rough times. They wanted to believe in this really cool guy that works for their government that goes across the world and kills dudes and has lots of sex and drinks martinis. It's this kind of fantastical um, uh, attachment of coolness onto something that isn't cool, like war and international strife and domestic upheaval. So Connery kind of represented this balance of being uh, silly but still based in reality, which is kind of the same thing that we get when we transition to 2006 when Daniel Craig portrays Bond, and Mads Mikkelsen from Casino Royale crushes his balls with a rope. His being Daniel Craig, since this is the Mads Mikkelsen from Casino Royale crushing Daniel Craig's balls with a rope podcast. But before we get to that, we still got Roger Moore and Pierce Brosnan to talk about. We're going to skip Timothy Dalton because his movies were kind of unremarkable, though I'm a personal big fan. But Roger Moore and Pierce Brosnan kind of represented this seismic shift towards the silliness, towards the ridiculousness. They fully embraced just absolute over-the-top, ridiculous insanity. Lots of wild stuff going on. I mean, Roger Moore was in a movie called Octopussy. I think that speaks for itself. So it's this weird age of total fantastical insanity. Again, I think kind of as to hold a mirror image to society. Roger Moore's film started in the mid 70s, which once again, immense political strife, and the trends that the Roger Moore films began of craziness, of weirdness, of just obscene silliness, really carried over into the popular culture of films in the 80s, which are exemplified by the last couple Roger Moore movies and then even the Pierce Brosnan movies in the 90s, which similarly represent this kind of grungy aesthetic, but it's still very based in, reality, real dark imaginings, dark issues. Sorry, I just had to take a big swig of piss. So it's this kind of grungy but still silly aesthetic that Pierce Brosnan leaves us off with in Die Another Day, which came out in 2002. Which brings us to, film in the 2000s, which was a very weird transitory period in film because, not only is it the convergence of a lot of technological things, but it's also the convergence of geopolitical issues, which paint our art and our culture in such profound ways. There's no way that we could really discuss Mads Mikkelsen from Casino Royale crushing Daniel Craig's balls with a rope without looking at that. In a post 2001 world, society really changed, especially in the way it handles, in the way it handles everything, but especially for art that's concerned with, again, geopolitics, war, international conflict and strife, and things like spies. In the post 2001 world, you get a lot of super actiony guy bro films about like American soldiers ruthlessly murdering foreign civilians in super gritty yet simultaneously over the top ways. That's why we have a bunch of that kind of gave rise to the future of the action blockbuster, which has really permeated our culture ever since. But at the same time, technologies in film gave way to a totally brand new form of melodramatic silliness, just ridiculousness, because CGI advanced. Well, I hesitate to say advanced because it still does not look great in a lot of ways, but it became such commonplace that you started getting entire movies with whole characters, whole scenes, whole set pieces that are entirely computer animated, which allowed not only for an explosion in the growth of what types of movies could be made, but it also kind of set off a tonal shift because you couldn't have these super serious, gritty films that are filled with CGI because, it would be very out of place, especially since CGI wasn't really advanced enough to that level at that time, and even still isn't really. Um, and then you also had films that were heavily dependent on CGI that were totally ridiculous, but also just had this melodrama attached to them. I think the best example of it is the Spider-Man series, the Sam Raimi series of films with Tobey Maguire as Spider-Man. It shows this kind of a seismic shift towards CGI ridiculousness with a very dramatic and emotional plot, which has really paved the way for film in the modern era, where the only way any studio makes money is when they make these superhero movies, which are just CGI fests, with these CGI monstrosities all having emotions and caring about each other and all that. So that kind of brings us to this weird conjunction for 2006, for the new James Bond film, Casino Royale. There were two very clear approaches here. Either they could take the model that so many films of that era did, take the gritty, realistic, but over the top action blockbuster approach, where there's very little joy, lots of depression, lots of angry men killing uh, people who probably don't deserve it. Or it could take the Roger Moore, Pierce Brosnan ridiculousness approach and just go crazy off the wall with it. And when I reference the meat of this podcast, that Mads Mikkelsen uses a rope to crush Daniel Craig's balls with it. It's honestly kind of hard to tell which way it went down that fork in the road, because on the one hand that could be very tense, very dark, very gritty, but at the same time it is kind of silly. It's the silliness isn't lost on me, despite being such a fan, such a influencer when it comes to the question of Mads Mikkelsen from Casino Royale crushing Daniel Craig's balls with a rope. But it's still, it's a little silly, a little wacky. Um, so weird mixture point, new Bond, new era, in this weird post 9/11 world of film, and ultimately the direction that they decided to go with was to go in the dark and gritty direction for film. So Casino Royale, the film in which Mads Mikkelsen from Casino Royale crushes Daniel Craig's balls with a rope, comes out 2006, um, and it's a darker take on Bond, a more serious take on Bond than we've ever seen. Bond isn't so smooth in this one, isn't so suave. He's kind of just like a hardcore trained killer bro, which was always kind of a secondary thought for the previous guys. The previous guys were these like cool dudes who had gadgets and like banged hot ladies, and Danny Craig, who gets his balls crushed with a rope by Mads Mikkelsen from Casino Royale, is, he's just kind of a crazy murdering lunatic dude. So that's kind of an interesting perspective on Bond that these films took, and it kind of represents the shift into a new direction, a new world in which, we as an audience say, hey, Mads Mikkelsen from Casino Royale just crushed Daniel Craig's balls with a rope. We like that. We love that. We are so into that. It's amazing. And it's an interesting point in film history. So now that we've kind of covered the basic essentials of the history that brought us to the point in which Mads Mikkelsen from Casino Royale crushed Daniel Craig's balls with a rope. Now let's talk about our leading men a little bit. First, that being Daniel Craig, whose balls are crushed by a rope wielded by Mads Mikkelsen from Casino Royale. The interesting thing about Casino Royale is that it was really kind of a launching point for both of these actors. Daniel Craig, whose balls get crushed with a rope wielded by Mads Mikkelsen, has had a pretty lengthy filmography before before Casino Royale, the film in which he gets his balls crushed by a rope by Mads Mikkelsen, but none of them are that high profile of releases. He plays a role in Lara Croft Tomb Raider from 2001, which was a semi high profile release, and he was in Road to Perdition, which of course was pretty big. It was pretty big, but outside of that, when you look at his filmography, they're all a lot of kind of lower key, less influential big movies. Of course, he was also in Munich, which was fairly big for its time, but for the most part, he was the leading man in a lot of smaller films, and then played kind of a smaller part in big films. So Casino Royale was really his first leading role in a big film, and what a leading role it was. As obviously, we all know he gets his balls crushed by a rope by Mads Mikkelsen. So that's something. It's really quite the start. And now Mads, who from Casino Royale crushes Daniel Craig's balls with a rope, has an even more interesting filmography because prior to Casino Royale, he really didn't have much of anything to go in terms of big leading roles, big films at all. His early filmography is a lot of Polish, which is where he's from, I believe. Or no, excuse me, Danish. That's where he's from. Very sorry, Mads, who from Casino Royale crushes Daniel Craig's balls with a rope. Lots of Danish films, and a couple of American films or English films, but none particularly big. So it's interesting that he got cast in the role as the Bond villain of Casino Royale. A film in which he crushes Daniel Craig's balls with a rope. But it's a great casting. He works great as a scary and kind of creepy weirdo, just kind of spooky dude. Totally seems like the kind of guy who would in fact use a rope to crush Daniel Craig's balls from Casino Royale, which is exactly what he does. So lots of factors really coming together to make Casino Royale the film it was, and most importantly, the film in which Mads Mikkelsen crushes Daniel Craig's balls with a rope. So that all is really kind of the history behind all of the events that kind of occurred to make 2006's release of Casino Royale a film in which Daniel Craig gets his balls crushed by Mads Mikkelsen. Very unique, a perfect storm for Mads Mikkelsen from Casino Royale to crush Daniel Craig's balls with a rope. So we're at about 25 minutes now, which I think is a good length of time. You know, I don't want to for lack of a better phrase, blow my load here on you know, the important discussion at hand. So I think that will do it for this inaugural episode of the Mads Mikkelsen from Casino Royale crushes Daniel Craig's balls with a rope podcast. In the next episode, we're going to talk a little bit about the sexual pathology behind this event. You know, the conflicting factors about, you know, balls, rope, Mads, you know, all that. So stay tuned for an update on social media for episode 2 of the Mads Mikkelsen from Casino Royale crushes Daniel Craig's balls with a rope podcast. And I'll see you then. Thanks for listening. See you next time. Bye.